They say when the axe falls, you don't feel the first swing, just the silence after. That's what struck me most. Not the words she used, not the paper sliding across the desk, but the silence, the surgical, premeditated kind. Like I was already gone before I walked in. My name is Daniel Reed. I'm 53 years old, or as Ivy Greer so gracefully put it, a legacy operator. I was the Senior Vice President of Strategic Revenue at Halverson Dynamics, a Fortune 200 tech logistics firm. For the past 9 years, my division carried 59.3% of the entire company's revenue stream. I know the exact number because I built the system that tracks it. I architected every metric, modeled every funnel, reviewed every dashboard the board loves to applaud themselves for understanding. And still, that morning, I was summoned to the 47th floor for what she called a realignment conversation. Ivy Greer didn't look up when I entered. She kept her eyes on a MacBook screen as she spoke, like reading lines from a performance only she was invited to. Her voice was flat, polished. She had that tone, one consultants pick up after too many years pitching to VCs. I sat down and waited. She didn't offer coffee, just kept going. "Daniel, you've built remarkable value here," she said. "But as we pivot into an agile-first ecosystem, we're recognizing that some leadership styles, while effective historically, are no longer aligned with where we're headed." I blinked once. Agile-first ecosystem. That's how they do it now. Dress up betrayal in buzzwords. Corporate poetry meant to dehydrate your dignity without making a sound. Then she said it. "You embody a system we're trying to outgrow." She finally looked up, just long enough to slide the termination papers across the table. Not even a folder, just a loose stack of unsigned farewells. Her fingers didn't tremble. Mine didn't either. "I assume this wasn't a performance review," I said quietly. She smiled, but it didn't touch her eyes. "This is a direction decision, not a judgment on your contributions." I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I could have recited a dozen reasons why firing me was self-sabotage in a tailored pantsuit. But I knew the type. Ivy wasn't after efficiency. She was after narrative. She wanted to be seen as the visionary who untethered Halverson from its institutional anchors. Cutting off the hand that fed the company didn't matter if she could spin the story into a podcast episode and a keynote. So I stood, reached across the table, shook her hand with the same grip I'd used to close 8-figure deals, and I smiled. Because nothing confuses a predator like prey that doesn't run. The elevator was empty, all chrome and silence. I looked at my reflection in the wall, dark suit, salt and pepper hair, jaw tight, eyes clearer than they'd been in years. I didn't look defeated. I looked unplugged, like a circuit had just gone dark, and the hum I'd lived with for over a decade had finally stopped. I didn't go back to my office. No dramatic goodbyes, no packing of photos or farewell speeches to the team. They didn't deserve to watch me walk out like a ghost. Let them hear about it secondhand. Feel the hole in the floor after I was gone. That's how tectonic shifts work. You don't notice until the quake is over. By the time I reached the parking lot, it was pouring, no umbrella, just rain slicking my coat, dripping from my nose. I walked slowly, let it soak into my skin like baptism. The badge in my pocket was already deactivated. My car, a black Lexus I barely drove anymore, blinked in the dark like it recognized the end of something. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the tower of glass and steel I'd helped build. Not physically, but in every metric that mattered, every line of scalable growth, every client relationship Ivy now took for granted. The board didn't even show. Most of them came up under me. I trained them, vouched for them, shielded them during downturns. And now, silence. No calls, no hands on my shoulder, just omission. The professional kind. The corporate execution where they skip the gunshot and just erase your name from the slide deck. That's when the clarity hit. I wouldn't scream on LinkedIn, wouldn't sue, wouldn't beg them to reconsider. I knew something Ivy didn't. I knew where the real levers were, where the old contracts lived, the ones she never read, the ones I wrote. I looked at my own reflection in the driver's side window, rain streaming down both sides of the glass. I whispered it to myself, not a threat, not a vow, just a truth being born. "I won't burn the building down," I said. "I'll just unplug the power feeding it." Then I got in, started the car, and drove off without looking back. The first 48 hours were quiet. That was by design. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. not my daughter, not my closest team members. I just let the silence stretch long enough for Ivy and the board to assume I'd accept my fate like a relic, pack up, check out, and fade into a dignified retirement. They didn't know I wasn't built for that kind of ending. I wasn't angry yet, not in the loud, righteous way. But something colder had settled in, a kind of clarity you don't ask for, but once it shows up, it stays. I started in my home office, same one I'd worked out of during the early days of Halverson's hybrid revolution, which, ironically, I spearheaded. The place hadn't changed much. Same leather chair, same 2 monitors, same corkboard with dead Sharpies and scribbled notes from strategies past. But what I came for wasn't on any board. It was buried 3 folders deep on a drive nobody knew existed. 3 years ago, when Halverson hit a cash flow choke during the pandemic's second wave, I did what Ivy and the current C-suite didn't know how to do. I bet on the future with my own money. I personally financed a short-term licensing deal to secure the predictive analytics platform we now branded as HalSight. It wasn't even called that back then. It was just a stripped-down engine from a failing startup in Denver. But I saw what it could be, paid the license fee out of pocket, and had legal draft the paperwork under a temporary clause that, at the time, seemed harmless. That clause became my first weapon. It took me an hour to find the file. The naming conventions were old school. Debian IP restruct draft, v3 final. Of course, buried inside was the contract. And inside that contract, under section 9.2.4b, were the words I was hoping to find. In the event that the system or its derivative is materially altered, rebranded, or distributed commercially under a separate entity, without credit or compensation to the initial financier, hereafter, licensor, operational rights shall revert fully to the licensor pending arbitration or settlement. They'd rebranded the system, rolled it out with press releases and ribbon-cutting Zooms. Ivy had even mentioned HalSight in her keynote, calling it our flagship pillar of next-gen transformation. I chuckled, alone in my office. She had no idea the ground she was standing on was leased from me. Still, I needed more than a clause. I needed strategy. So, I made a call. Omar Patel had been my right hand for 6 years. He was smart, loyal, and recently reorganized out of the company with one of those HR emails that says everything and nothing at once. I texted him one line, "You still believe in HALSIGHT?" 10 minutes later, we had dinner booked at a quiet tapas place on the east side of town. No fanfare. Just 2 men in sport coats who used to run a kingdom, now turned out to pasture by people who thought vision came with age limits. He showed up 10 minutes early. That used to annoy me when he worked for me. Now I respected it. "You got hit too?" he asked before we sat down. I nodded. 2 days ago, Ivy did it personally. "She did mine through a Zoom call," he said, chuckling without humor. "Didn't even spell my name right in the exit paperwork." We didn't talk tactics, not directly. We talked like 2 lawyers who already understood the case but needed to hear it said aloud. "She doesn't know what she's standing on," I said. "She thinks it's marble, it's glass," he replied. He'd seen what I saw. The platform she'd called the company's future was stitched together with threads only a few of us truly understood. And Ivy? She was marketing it like it was proprietary genius, not an inherited draft. "She'll keep pushing it until it breaks," I said. "Or until someone pulls the plug," he replied. We didn't need to clink glasses or make dramatic vows. We were old builders, the kind who didn't take pride in revenge, but in correction. When I got home, I went to the storage room off the garage. There was an old fireproof safe beneath a row of holiday decorations. Inside, 2 thumb drives, 1 external hard drive, and a dusty manila folder with scribbled tabs, contracts, IP memos, original architecture flows. Artifacts of an era they thought they'd buried under a new logo and a younger CEO. I booted the drive up. The UI was archaic, but the data lived, raw code, version histories, and most important of all, the licensing agreement countersigned by our former general counsel, who now worked for a firm that still owed me a favor. That night, I sat in front of that flickering screen, lit only by the glow of documentation they'd never bothered to read. They thought they fired a name, a role, a number on a spreadsheet. What they really did was wake up the architect. And Ivy? She was about to learn the first rule of taking over a kingdom. Don't demolish the old guard until you know who built the locks. The ballroom at the Sandridge Innovation Summit smelled like money and manufactured ambition. White leather chairs, LED-lit panels, a rotating holographic display that read, "Redefining Agility." Every other word that week had been disruption, like chanting it enough times would erase the past instead of repackaging it. Ivy Greer stood center stage in a cobalt suit that looked like it had been algorithmically selected for power optics. The lights hit her just right. Her voice carried over the mic with that tech conference cadence, half conviction, half well-rehearsed illusion. "Halcite," she said, pausing for effect, "is not just a tool, it's a philosophy, a reinvention of how data translates into momentum." I stood at the back of the room, arms folded, watching the screens behind her flash with graphs I'd built, systems I'd architected, KPIs I once refined by hand in midnight planning sessions. My name was nowhere on them, but I didn't need it to be. I wasn't there for credit. I was there to start the clock. I slipped out before the applause, quiet as a shadow. The front desk at her hotel was easy to navigate. Executives always leave a trail of preferences and pretense. Ivy was in the penthouse suite, because of course she was. I left the envelope at her door, tucked beneath the handle. No return name, just ivory cardstock and a seal she'd recognize. Inside, a single sentence. "You built your castle on borrowed bricks. Some of them are mine." Below it, a photocopy of the licensing clause, section 9.2.4, B, highlighted in yellow, the kind of yellow that meant warning, not caution. I didn't wait around for the fallout. I walked 2 blocks to a quiet cafe, opened my laptop, and fired off a message to Jordan Lai, a tech journalist I'd mentored years ago when he was fresh out of grad school and hungry to break stories bigger than funding rounds. Subject line, "Do you believe in ghosts?" The body of the email contained a single link to a secure drive. No name, no context, just documents, timestamps, and the clause. By morning, the headline hit LinkedIn like a virus. Did Tech Titan build innovation on borrowed IP? The article was clean, factual, surgical. No names were stated outright, but the dots were easy enough to connect. It didn't accuse, just ask damning questions. Who owned the underlying infrastructure of HALSIGHT? Who financed its prototype? Where were the operational credits? The stock dipped within hours. Halverson Dynamics posted a vague statement about inaccuracies circulating online and unsubstantiated speculation. Ivy didn't respond publicly, but her legal team found my number before lunch. First, it was a voicemail from someone named Rachel, corporate counsel. Then an email with the subject line, "Seeking clarification on documentation." I didn't answer, not yet. I spent the afternoon watching market chatter. The stock held, but fragile. Analysts started whispering about governance gaps, about the dangers of gutting legacy leadership too quickly. I read every word like poetry. I wasn't aiming to ruin them, just to remind them who built the engine they were now joyriding. Around 3 p.m., Ivy finally sent her own email. It was short, no header, no defense, no excuses. "We need to talk." I replied 3 hours later, after dinner and a long walk by the river. "Let's talk soon." Just that. Let her stew in the space between my silence and her fear. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window of my apartment. Below, the city pulsed like a living organism, hungry, mechanical, beautiful in its indifference. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt exact, like a scalpel in the right hands. Precision wasn't always about damage, sometimes it was about alignment. The truth was, I didn't want Halverson to implode. I didn't want Ivy exiled or disgraced. I wanted recognition, not for myself, but for the architecture, for the idea that systems matter, that the past isn't dead weight, it's foundation. You don't build agility by amputating your spine. I poured another drink and stared at the document still open on my screen. Code I hadn't touched in months, contracts I'd once read like scripture. The younger version of me who wrote them was hopeful, maybe even naive, but he'd also been smart, thorough. And now, decades later, his work was defending him from erasure. They called it restructuring, but it was never about structure. It was about story. Ivy wanted to reshape the narrative, make it hers. And for a while, it worked. But every narrative, no matter how clean, is vulnerable to a footnote. Mine just became the headline. And the story? It was only getting started. The boardroom felt smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the tension hanging in the air, thick and clinical, like the scent of lemon cleaner and fear. Maybe it was the silence before I walked in. Dozens of conversations cut short by the sound of the door opening. They hadn't expected me to show. Not really. They'd sent the invite out of protocol, a professional courtesy. What they didn't realize was, this wasn't a courtesy call for me. This was the checkmate. I took my seat at the far end of the table. Not the head. Never needed it. I preferred the view from the edge. You see more from the margins. Ivy sat 2 seats down, perfectly poised, her navy blouse pressed crisp, her laptop already open like a shield. She didn't look at me. The general counsel cleared his throat. "We appreciate you taking the time, Daniel. Obviously things have escalated." "No need for euphemisms," I said calmly. "The article shook the market. Your legal exposure is measurable, and your CEO's credibility is in question. Let's call it what it is." Ivy finally glanced at me. "This feels like a misunderstanding that's been weaponized." I tilted my head. "A misunderstanding? You rebranded and monetized a platform funded by my personal capital, ran a full campaign around it, and didn't even bother to check if the license had caveats. That's not a misunderstanding, Ivy. That's arrogance." A few of the board members shifted in their seats. One of them, Linda, old school, sharp as ever, looked at me over her glasses. "We'd like to discuss options for resolution. Quiet ones." I nodded. "That's why I'm here." I pulled out a folder. No theatrics, no lawyer beside me, just pages, dates, signatures. I slid them forward. "These are the original licensing agreements. Here are the emails with timestamps proving both knowledge and access by your previous legal department. And here," I tapped the last page, "is the clause Ivy never read, the one that reverts ownership upon material alteration without credit or compensation." Ivy didn't move, but her fingers curled just slightly around her stylus. General counsel flipped through the pages, face tightening with each line. "This does establish a credible claim," he said slowly. "Not a claim," I corrected. "A reality." Linda folded her hands. "What do you want, Daniel?" I leaned back, paused, let the question breathe. "Not a buyout," I said. "Not a settlement. I want the division I built, the people, the clients, the infrastructure, spun off as its own entity, clean, independent, and under my control. I walk with what's mine. You keep the rest." Murmurs. Shock. One of the younger board members looked like he was about to choke on his protein bar. Ivy leaned forward. "You can't expect us to hand over our most profitable arm because of a decades-old clause." "Funny," I said. "That profitable arm exists because of a decades-old clause." She tried to keep her composure. "This isn't about the clause. It's about you trying to make a point. About ego." I looked her dead in the eye. "This isn't about ego. It's about origin. You can pretend you invented fire, Ivy, but I lit the match and you built your brand on the warmth. Now, I'm taking my flame back." The board recessed for 15 minutes. Standard procedure. Time to panic in private. I stepped into the hallway, hands in my pockets, watching the skyline through a pane of glass that had seen more turnover than strategy. Ivy followed, her heels sharp against the floor. "You know what you're doing? We'll tear this place apart," she said quietly. I turned to her. What I'm doing is cutting the rot before it poisons the rest." Her face twisted, something between fury and fear. "You're going to gut the company just to prove you're still relevant?" "No," I said. "I'm building something new with the parts you tried to bury. I'm not the past, Ivy. I'm the foundation you ignored." She looked like she wanted to say more, but didn't. The vote was unanimous. Linda delivered it with a small nod. "We'll announce the spin-off at quarter end. You'll have your entity, your clients, and clean legal separation." No applause, no smiles. Just tension peeled back like old wallpaper, revealing the truth underneath. That night, I stood on the rooftop of the very building I was fired from, cigar in hand, jacket loose over my shoulders. The city pulsed beneath me, all noise and light and ambition. I used to look at this skyline and feel trapped. Now, I saw blueprints, not of buildings, but of ideas, of futures. The door behind me creaked open. Linda stepped out briefly. held up a glass in a silent toast, then slipped back inside. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. I took a long drag of the cigar and exhaled into the wind. They tried to erase me, but you can't delete the architect. This building was never a prison. It was proof. Launch day didn't feel like a parade. It felt like precision. No banners, no speeches, just people in motion, plugging in systems, testing networks, booting dashboards I helped design from scratch. The office wasn't flashy, but it didn't need to be. Concrete floors, high ceilings, walls of glass that let the morning spill in without asking permission. Everything was intentional. Everything was earned. The company name, Catalyst Grid, was printed in clean steel above the front entrance. Not after me, not after anyone. Just an idea. Spark meets structure. The moment something old gives way to something necessary. I walked the open floor slowly, pausing every so often to catch familiar voices, half-remembered jokes, the quiet intensity of people who believed in what they were building. Half my old team had followed, not because I asked, because they knew. They knew what we created wasn't just profitable. It was principled, built with spine and clarity. And now they had skin in the game. We didn't poach, we didn't chase, we just built a better gravity. "Morning, Dan," said Claire as she passed by, two laptops tucked under one arm. She used to run integration under Ivy. Now she ran it for herself. She smiled like someone who knew exactly what she was worth, and was finally in a place that did too. We had clients before we had furniture. The moment the spin-off deal closed, 5 of the 7 enterprise accounts called me directly. Ivy's version of HALSIGHT was bloated and incoherent without the architecture we carried over. They knew where the real machinery lived. Now they were back, contracts signed, renewals tripled. I stopped at the center of the floor, where the light was strongest, watched as one of our new hires, young, probably mid-20s, stood staring at the onboarding binder, clearly unsure whether to approach me. He finally did. "Mr. Reed?" he asked. "Can I ask something?" "Drop the mister," I said. "And sure." He glanced around hesitant. "Why didn't you just sue them into the ground? I mean, you probably could have crushed them, legally, publicly." I smiled, not out of amusement, out of recognition. I'd asked myself the same question once. "Because that would have been personal," I said. This is structural." He blinked. "Ivy made the mistake a lot of people make when they inherit power," I continued. "She thought rewriting the narrative meant she owned the plot, but legacy isn't about noise. It's about foundation. You don't destroy the blueprint and expect the building to stand." He nodded slowly, then went back to his desk, thoughtful in a way that told me he'd remember that answer long after today. At 3:12 p.m., my cell buzzed. I glanced at the screen and let out a small breath. Mason Group calling. They'd been Halverson's biggest legacy client. Ivy lost them when she tried to resell them on a system they already owned. I tapped to answer. "Daniel Reed," I said. The voice on the other end was brisk, direct. "We're moving forward. If your offer still stands, we're signing this week." "It stands," I said. "Welcome to Catalyst." No need to gloat, no need to explain. They understood what mattered, who mattered. By late afternoon, the office had quieted. The first day adrenaline gave way to focus, to rhythm. People weren't celebrating, they were creating. And that, more than anything, told me we'd already won. I climbed the stairs to the rooftop. No elevators in this place yet, just steps you had to take yourself. When I opened the door, the air was cool and dry, tinged with the faint scent of city concrete and momentum. I stood at the edge with a paper cup of coffee, watching the skyline as the sun lowered behind it, casting everything in gold and gray. From here, I could see the old Halverson Tower, still tall, still sharp, but no longer imposing. I didn't miss it, not the title, not the board meetings, not the elevator speeches to investors who couldn't read a balance sheet if it hit them in the chest. What I missed, I had again, on my terms. Somewhere down there, Ivy was probably in a meeting, trying to fix numbers she didn't understand, trying to tell a story that no longer belonged to her. I didn't feel bitter. I felt clear. Because I didn't rebuild to prove anything. I rebuilt because the structure mattered. A gust of wind swept across the rooftop, carrying with it the sound of distant traffic and maybe, just maybe, the silence of a company realizing what they'd let go. I took one last sip of coffee, let it sit on my tongue, then smiled to myself. They thought I was the past. But I wasn't a relic, I was the blueprint. And this time, the ink doesn't bleed.